Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Alberta Provincial election forecast. So, unless we get a higher uptick in polls, this might be the last one before the actual campaign starts, because the actual campaign's probably going to... there might be one more in April, depending. But anyways, there's likely going to be only one more before the Alberta election starts, so this is just really going to give us a really good overview of where we are. Looking at this, I will just note two things. Well, three. So, anyone who saw this post originally on Twitter or has come by it from Twitter, because I'm going to be linking this video through a retweet, I have fixed Lethbridge because I consistently and always mix up Lethbridge east and west for some reason when I color this map in Alberta. I don't know why I always do this, but every single time it seems I do this mistake. I have corrected this mistake now. The numbers, or the map as posted on Twitter, is technically correct, just mentally flip Lethbridge east and west. It has no effect on the result other than those two writings. But the actual math says this result, which is the correct result. Anyways, the one, just for the people who only watch on YouTube, I have done a couple of changes to the back end of the model. Not anything very significant if we go here and just look at historical or the trend. The main result here is it's boosted the Liberals a little bit, which maybe could be wrong, but it's not a very significant result either way. Basically, I've slightly changed how the model calculates the biases of regions, and the regions being like the Edmonton area, the Calgary area, and then like everywhere else in Alberta. How I've calculated those historical biases. And historical bias is basically like Calgary votes. I don't know the numbers off my head. Actually, I should be able to pull it up here. Calgary votes 1 point to the rest of the rest of the province for the the UCP overperforms the rest of the province by 1 point in Calgary. They underperform the rest of the province by 11 points in Edmonton. That's like the historical basis that my numbers have calculated. The other thing I have slightly changed is I had missed some data somehow. Anyways, of 2015, so I've entered that data back in, and it's about polling history, historical polling error. It hasn't actually really changed any of the data or any of the results, but it's good to have that. So those two things haven't really changed anything other than they slightly boosted the Liberals provincially, which, I mean, if they run a near full slate of candidates, 1% seems plausible. And keep in mind, too, that once the candidate lists are known, and I factor that in, it's likely going to crater the Liberals, because I don't think they're going to be able to run a full slate of candidates in Alberta. But, with no further ado, let us get into the actual meat and potatoes here, and not just what has slightly changed and how I'm calculating numbers. So, the core gist of this election is, and has always been, regardless of what anyone has been saying, some of the fear-mongering is the wrong word, some of the hopium last year from NDPers or people who don't like the Conservatives, or Smith particularly, being like, the NDP is going to win. No. That wasn't going to happen. The NDP wasn't going to affirmatively win. The UCP could have lost, but the NDP was never going to win. This is a very important distinction. The NDP did not win in 2015. The Conservatives, between the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party, lost in 2015. One of those parties should have been able to win, except they managed to split the vote, ideally, and there was many, many seats where the NDP barely won. Coming out with like 33% of the vote kind of thing to a 30-30 vote split from PCs in Wild Rose. That is a situation we're seeing now, and it's always been the situation in Alberta. The NDP has no path to victory. Notley seems, frankly, to be a decent politician. She seems to have good instincts. She seems to be able to do things properly. The fact that she managed to retain leadership after losing an election where she was the incumbent premier is a good show that she has good control over her caucus, good control over messaging discipline, has a broad support among people in her party. And the fact that you managed to steer the NDP into currently a significantly better position than 2019. They're up nearly 7 points in popular vote, albeit not too many seats, but still significant gains in popular vote is also worth noting. But the NDP vote in Alberta is horrendously inefficient. Now, that might surprise people, especially when you're looking at this map, because you look at a lot of these NDP seats in Edmonton, for example, where the NDP have the most margins. And there's only 3 seats that are in this 30-plus column. You look at the UCP, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 seats who are in the 30-plus column. So right there, you would assume the UCP should have more inefficient vote share, because they have a lot of seats that they completely blow out of the water. Whereas the NDP only really blow out downtown Edmonton. Some of the outskirts of Edmonton really are only in the 10 to 20 margin, which is just a normal margin. 10 to 20 points is where a incumbent that the locals like should rest. Generally speaking, if you're doing much worse than that, you are either in a hyper-marginal riding or not a very good incumbent. And I don't think anyone is going to argue that the inner suburbs, the outer core, I'm not really sure how you want to call this, let's call it the outer core of Edmonton, is hyper-marginal ridings. In fact, since the NDP became a big deal in the province, I think the NDP's won most of these Edmonton ridings in every election. Though, to be fair, that might be only 3 elections. But anyways. The problem here for the NDP is their vote is entirely in the downtown cores of cities. Mostly just Edmonton and Calgary. Yes, you have Lethbridge. Yes, you have kind of Lesser Slave Lake. This is in play, sort of. You have Banff, whatever the rest of that word is. I don't have it off the top of my head. Regardless, there's a couple of rural ridings or small cities that they are competitive in. But most of their vote is in Edmonton proper and central Calgary. North Central? Let's say that, North Central Calgary. If they win all of these marginal ridings, they still lose the election. They pick up Lesser Slave Lake. They pick up this one right here, which is sort of in play, but not really. I can't think of the name of it. That's 2. And then let's be generous, and they pick up, 7 of the marginal ridings in Calgary, which would be a huge pickup for them. That's 9 seats. So it's 40 to 47, and that's still a UCP win. Even if they won all of the marginal ridings, they're not even that marginal, but all of the ridings that they could conceivably win in Calgary, if they won all of them, so all of these 5 to 10 margin ridings, the UCP, That still only puts it at 43 to 44. That is still a defeat. If the NDP currently win every riding that they are behind in, but are conceivably competitive, they still lose the election. Now, you see some big names like 338 or Brian from Too Close to Call. They're forecasting a much closer race. Yes. And I don't think you should necessarily take my result or their result as wrong or my result as correct. Listen to people's arguments, look at people's models, look at their track records, by all means. But even those, for example, 338 here. Just bring it over here so everyone can see it. Note, he has the UCP up 2 percentage points, whereas I have the UCP up, showing here, 8 percentage points in the popular vote. But even with just a 2 margin, he has 45 to 42. And the recent polls are more drastic pro-UCP than that. We look at Too Close to Call here. What do we have? Well, he has just a 1 point margin, but he has 41 to 46. So yes, my model's quite bullish on the UCP. But nobody, even with the lesser margins that other forecasters are forecasting, people who have good, long-standing track records, none of them are forecasting an NDP victory. And the really important thing to note here, 338 nor Too Close to Call, as far as I'm aware, meaningfully calculate polling error. I know 338 Canada has his pollster ratings. I'm not really sure how those work in the back end for him. But in general, he doesn't try to correct consistent error in polling. And I know from talking to him, Brian really doesn't, from Too Close to Call, doesn't do it. In general terms, he actually, from the sounds of it, don't put me words in, I'm not putting words in the guy's mouth, but the general vibe I get from him is he doesn't think it is a good idea to do it. So that's a disagreement there, but I do forecast that. And if you look at previous elections in Alberta, not just 2019, but all the way back, every election in, not in history, but in the modern era. And just to be clear here, when I'm counting as the dates of the modern era, you could go arbitrarily far back, but I think I went only... Yeah, I only went to about 2000. Across this whole time period, the Conservatives, the right wing in general, the mainstream right wing party, that I should say, which was the PCs before, now it's the UCPs, has had an average of a multiplicative 16% underestimation. So in other words, if the polls, as 338 has, are currently at 46%, and you multiply that by 1.16, you get 53, which is actually more aggressive than I currently have. Similarly, the NDP underperforms polls by about 0.12%. So in other words, if they're getting 44% in polling average, they actually get probably 39%. in result. Again, I'm actually forecasting the NDP to overperform that historical average. Because the thing is, in my model, I do account for polling error, but I don't necessarily make it sacrosanct. But it is considered. And this is one of the reasons why my model, I think, might be the most bullish model for the UCP. I think I'm genuinely the only person who's seriously calculating polling error in this race. And this isn't even just a case of in Alberta provincial elections, this historically happens. You look at federal elections, and we get a very similar gist. 2021, just 2 years ago, the Conservative Party in Alberta finished with 55%. Polling average was 48%. They were off by 7 percentage points, the polling average. That is a very large margin. Actually, very similar to the 1.16 times I have for the provincial elections. It was 1.15. Very similar. And that's really the gist here. Polling in Alberta doesn't seem to be very good. And I don't think it's because the pollsters are bad or the pollsters are trying to get it wrong. I think there's two major factors that play here. One is really easily explainable. It's differential turnout rates. Most Canadian pollsters don't seem to do any form of likely voter screening. Some of them implicitly have them, such as the online panels like Ledger. It implicitly has a likely voter screen just because no one is going to sign up and respond to online surveys about politics that isn't interested in politics. It's just not going to happen. If you don't care, you're not going to bother proactively signing up. So there is intrinsically a likely voter filter there, but it's not a perfect likely voter filter. And one of the reasons why this is a significant factor is because the party that gets most of the older voters usually overperforms other polls, or other parties, or their polling. One of the main reasons for this is differential turnout rates. Young people vote less than older people. Has this been a trend forever? I don't know, but it is a trend today. So if right now the UCP is getting 57% of 55 plus, and the UCP are getting the NDP are getting 35%, but conversely, the NDP are getting 46% of under 35s, and the UCP is getting 42%, you would expect the UCP to overperform the NDP, overperform their polling, and the NDP to underperform their polling because young people will vote less frequently and older people will vote more frequently. So you might get a turnout of 80% to 55 plus, but only 50% of under 35s. That's not always true, and it's one of the reasons why Trudeau won in 2015. The turnout of under 35s was quite high, and they voted for him. But that is the general trend. The other factor is, it seems to me, and I don't really have a good reason why this is happening, but it seems to me urban areas seem to tend to be oversampled. Not just in Canada, but in general, they seem oversampled. A very easy explanation, or way to see this, in my hypothesis here at least, is if you look at BC polling federally. Sometimes the BC polling might have the Conservatives as low as 20%, but then the same pollster, a couple of polls later, might have it as high as 40%. I don't think that is the case, that the pollster is just that much margin of error. It is conceivable that that margin of error could exist, because we're talking about samples about 160, which is, I believe, plus or minus 9 in a random sample. But I don't think that's the reason. What I think is happening there is that the polls are capturing more urban voters than rural voters. I don't really know why. Maybe it's easier to contact urban people. Maybe urban people have more free time, or they're more willing to answer the phones. I don't know. But it does seem to be a consideration too. The other region where this is really notable, obviously there's Alberta, but the other one that in Eastern Canada is Atlantic Canada. You have a very similar trend. Some of it could be explained by just randomness because of the margin of error. But I contend randomness is only part of the problem. I think it is regional sampling. As where Alberta and BC have, or just like Alberta and BC having these very large distinctions between rural areas and the urban areas in voting consideration, with places like Edmonton being plus, 12 NDP, whereas the rural areas are plus 25 UCP. You see very, very similar in BC. In fact, rural BC looks more like Alberta federally than it does Vancouver. You get the similar thing happen in Atlantic Canada. Halifax, Moncton, St. John are much more left-wing than rural areas in these provinces. So you might have a ledger poll that has 49% conservative in Atlantic Canada, and then the next ledger poll, or the previous one, might have had 30%. I'm not sure what the previous one had. Or you might have a situation, you see this frequently. Not just Ledger, but Abacus, Nanos, all these other pollsters, Main Street. I'll contend, at least without having seen the raw data, if one of these pollsters want to correct me in the comments, feel free, or they want to email me or message me. But I'll contend, I think one of the reasons why these areas seem so volatile, or so consistently wrong, and by wrong I mean off election results, because Atlantic Canada was also, the polling average in 2021 was also off the election results. They weren't very close. Is largely, or well, not largely, the other half of it is this sampling error. It seems urban voters respond more. And naturally, rural voters are more conservative. Okay, you might ask yourselves, how does that actually affect things? Don't they have these areas sampled? Regions, quotas. Yes. But there's a very big difference in just having quotas versus having an accurate reflective sample, especially when you start abstracting on a higher level. Maybe specifically in an Alberta provincial election where they have Calgary and Edmonton removed as subcategories, it's not as big a deal. Though history suggests otherwise. But federally, for sure, where it's all grouped as one province, that is almost certainly a factor. Okay, so there's all sorts of reasons I just outlined here where this is very clearly the UCP's race to lose, and it has always been their race to lose. Is it likely that they could even lose? That's the real question. Well, the general gist here is I wax and wane on this, but for right now, I'm thinking no. There was a very brief period in late December, early January where Smith was being really awkward, backtracking quite a bit on statements she was making, hadn't really made or nailed anything. But now a lot of her programs she's started, like she got the sovereignty bill passed, she's acquired the prescription medication, not the prescription medication, sorry, like the Tylenol and stuff that she promised to do. Her, for lack of a better term, her helicopter money is deploying. And as far from what I can see, not from Alberta, but I am paying attention to Alberta news recently, there hasn't really been any big scandals in the last 3 weeks, or any big backtracking or awkward moments. So it looks like she might have gotten her message discipline under control. She's actually rolling out a lot of the program promises that she could reasonably have done to this point. And as a result, you're seeing the polling trend in her favor. Just bear with me one moment. I will just get it up. So we got here. So just before Smith became leader, it was close. This is like, if we want to do the math on this, I think this is like 42% to 42%, just about, once you actually average this. A slight UCP lead. The first month and a bit, when she became leader, the NDP was leading, though I think that was largely not real. A perfect example of this is this 8% other from Janet Brown. That's just ridiculous. There's no way that 8% of Alberta is voting for some unknown party. If you consider who the voters leaving the UCP would go to, it'd probably be Wild Rose Independence Party. I don't really see the hard right in Alberta just making a brand new party at this point. I think if they are unhappy with the mainstream, they're going to just leave or vote to leave. But anyways. But since then, other than this one poll from Abacus, which seems to be an outlier to me, and most, especially since there's really no cross tables there, so I'm not accusing Abacus of being wrong. I just think this might be an outlier, and I don't have the cross tables to really examine it. But ignoring this one, we have an Angus Reid, 2 Main Street, and a Think HQ poll, which are all approximately the same. And it's all about 3-ish% margin in raw polling. So, since she's gotten herself on her feet, and she's gotten her groove going, Smith has really positioned herself in a solid position. And it doesn't really look like to me, based off polling and based off of the last 3 weeks, she's going to stumble a touchdown. I won't say it's impossible. Anything can happen in a campaign, and we are just shy of probably 2 months before it starts. I assume it's going to be mid-April. Actually calls it, because it has to be vote has to occur by May 29th, if I'm not mistaken. So she has probably mid-April, and I assume she's going to wait as long as possible just so she can have as much time to govern as she can. She'll table the budget and then run into the election on that budget, which seems to be the new trend in Canada. But the thing here is, it's not just about Smith stumbling. I have went on quite heavily on how the NDP's really not had any chance here. They never had a chance here. It was never about them. And I think if you actually talked to Notley off the record about this, she probably agrees with me that she has no path to victory other than not making any errors and forcing Smith to make an error. That is the NDP's only path to winning, and I think Notley would agree with me on that. But Smith, with a godsend from the NDP and the Liberals federally, is possibly going to be able to force the NDP into an unforced error. Well, into a forced error, I should say. It's about this just transition stuff. Smith has really been hitting it quite hard, and it's a very good thing to hit, because it's red meat to her base, because the UCP base largely likes oil and gas, either because of it's their job, it makes the province rich, they don't really care or don't like the climate alarmism, or any other reason. There's plenty of reasons why, but those are just some. So it's red meat to her base there. It's also red meat to her base in that it's affirmatively showing to them that she is going to continue battling for them. And that's one of the reasons why Smith was elected leader of the UCP. It's one of the reasons Albertans vote Conservative federally. I think in a large degree, Alberta is only as conservative as it is because of the alienation from Ottawa. If Ottawa wasn't continually attacking and demeaning Alberta's core industries, trying to impoverish Alberta, I think you could realistically have the NDP or the Liberals winning a bunch of seats in Calgary and Edmonton. Right now they currently have 4 between the two parties federally, though in reality I think that's more of a case of O'Toole was just so weak that a lot of Conservatives in Alberta stayed home. Not that those two parties did well. But if it wasn't for that, I think you could probably see 8 seats going to left-wing parties in Alberta quite easily. But there is so much hate on the province that people jump into the more conservative factions, not because they are ideologically conservative. They might not be conservative in the slightest, but they vote UCP or they vote conservative because they are sick and tired of federal politicians hurting their province. And this is where the just transition stuff is a godsend to Smith, because regardless of everything else Smith has done, most of her awkwardness and most of her gaffes, embarrassing, silly as they might be, are largely irrelevant. I think people put way too much stock in general into gaffes, into mistakes. They largely don't matter unless it's a big deal. Especially in 2023, people really put more into substance than style in practice. This is actually one of the reasons why Trudeau continually gets reelected by progressives. But the just transition is so good for Smith, not just because she can signal to her base, but it gives a clear issue against the NDP, a clear wedge to smash the NDP with. And unlike the Sovereignty Act, which is still a good wedge, by the way, the just transition is a fantastic wedge because it is an affirmative, positive edge for the most part. She's defending the interests of Albertans from a capricious federal government. So, to her voters, it is a positive thing. She is defending them. But it's also a big wedge because it takes the swing voters in places like rural Alberta, like Calgary, and it gives them a choice. You can go with the UCP, who is strongly against the just transition stuff, and has a track record and a history of defending the oil industry quite strongly, and the jobs involved in it. Or you can gamble with Notley. Sure, Notley is saying she's against the just transition, but do you really trust her? She is part of the NDP, and the federal NDP is saying this, is supporting it. And members of the NDP cabinet, inner circle of the party, currently elected MPs, are very clearly climate activists. Do you really trust that they will actually go to bat for Alberta, for an industry that they ideologically despise? So there's that factor in it too, and it really forces Noli's hand to disavow the federal NDP, but in the process of doing that, she alienates her own core voters. And if we remember from the first half of the video, a lot of Edmonton is only the 10 to 20 margin. A lot of it is only 5 to 10 margin. There's 4 ridings that are 5 to 10, and there's, 10 ridings or 9 ridings that are 10 to 20. These aren't really big margins. If we're in a situation where 2,000 or 3,000 NDP voters in some of these ridings stay home because they're upset that Notley is seemingly abandoning the climate agenda, and the Conservatives in these ridings actually turn out, you could see wild flips in Edmonton. I don't think it's going to happen, to be clear. But it's not inconceivable. Now, I'm sure Notley and the NDP at large have plans to make sure that their turnout actually gets out. In other words, their get out to vote machine is already in overdrive to try to figure out how to solve this problem. But it's still now a big issue, because now they have to spend more effort on get out to vote for their core voters and less on swing voters. Because if they don't get their core voters out, you could see random seat flips in Edmonton, or in central Calgary, or in Lethbridge, or Banff. Seat flips that no one could really forecast. And it won't be because the UCP did good in those seats. It'll be because NDP voters stayed home. So she has to spend resources and effort on that to stop that from happening. And that's not effort she can spend campaigning or pushing it out to vote elsewhere, because you have finite resources. So, on both ends, things like the Just Transition, or to a lesser degree, the Sovereignty Act, which is a very similar wedge issue, but complementary, are very good issues for Smith here. And again, they're one of the reasons why I think Smith should be able to sail through this. She showed herself with good instincts in the Alberta leadership race, the UCP leadership race, I should say. And currently, minus some gaffes, which are not good, but I think being oversold, she seems to be able, or she seems to have the political instincts here to hit the right notes. I think the only risk going forward for Smith is if she lets off the gas, or if she, for whatever reason, loses conviction. And this is where some of her gaffes might hurt her. They might alienate her own base. I don't think it's super likely, but it's possible. Largely because, as a conservative premier, or at least a premier of a conservative party, she's more libertarian than conservative, she will get blasted with hate messages from the media. I'm sure she also probably gets hate messages in her emails or whatever, but mainstream news press, federal politicians are always going to be hating on her. And it's not because of anything else other than the fact she's the leader of a conservative party. This is how it always goes. Just look at Poilievre federally. He gets many articles written about how he's a terrible person, right? How he can't win, or how he's naive or dumb, or whatever the current line of attack is against him. It's unfortunate. It's kind of silly. But it is the reality. And she needs, more than anything else, to grit her teeth and push through that and not let it get her off message, get her off target, or distract her campaign. She can do all those things. Yeah, she's going to win. And if I'm correct here, boy, well, I'm going to jab on this one so hard. The benefit of being the outlier on bullishness of a race is if you're correct, you get to brag so hard about it. If you're wrong, I mean, that's awkward as hell. But we will see. I'm extremely confident in this one. I think if I'm wrong here, I had to reevaluate my political instincts. But with that, if you like the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you think on this race. If you think I'm correct in my analysis, if you think I'm missing something, if you think I'm way too bullish, if you think I'm dumb, say those too. Sometimes your insults are really funny, actually. I don't get many on the Canadian videos, but sometimes the US ones get some really funny attacks on me, and I'm just like, what? I love those, actually. Fire those away if you have those. And let me know. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week, likely with one of my other series. I think Understanding Politics, possibly.